My name is Thomas, and I struggle with doubt. I followed Jesus for years. From the very first day he called me, I saw things so amazing they defied explanation. I believed. But then things fell apart. I witnessed the betrayal that led to the cruel march to Calvary and his agonizing crucifixion. I survived, but everyone I knew scattered. My world collapsed. Then came news of the empty tomb, the very first Easter. But I resisted. The image of his broken, lifeless body was still burned into my memory. I experienced his death, and I couldn't believe. Not until I see the scars with my own eyes and touch them with my own hands, I told the others. I wasn't ready to put my trust in something again. But Jesus came to me. He knew my doubts. He even named them. But he wasn't angry. He didn't rebuke me or dismiss me. He looked at me with those familiar eyes and offered me his scarred hands and side. In that moment, I experienced his resurrection, and I believed. I know firsthand it's difficult to believe in what you can't see. And yet all around you are people whose lives and stories have scars that bear witness to the meaning of Easter. Yes, these people have been wounded, but they've experienced redemption and healing through Jesus. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were meant to rescue the doubters, the debtors, and the broken, people like you and me. He met my doubts with grace and love, and he only asked one thing of me: believe.
I want to tell you an embarrassing story. One of those moments where I realized I was just way out of line for how a human should be acting. I can remember the night with such incredible vividness. If you know me, you know that I love sports. And in particular, I love baseball. And from the time I was a child, I've been a Red Sox fan. And the Red Sox I loved, but the Red Sox did not love me back. And I remember the night in October 2003 where I decided I had an unhealthy relationship with sports. The night was deeply saddening, but it's because it began with such incredible hope. It was Game 7 of the American League Championship Series, and we were tied with the mighty Yankees, who seemingly won every single year. And the game carried on into extra innings when a guy who's now the manager of the Yankees, who hadn't hit all season, did this against us.
Now we're tied at 5 as we go to the bottom of the 11th. Here's Aaron Boone to lead off.
His first at bat of the game. There's a fly ball deep to left. It's on its way. There it goes. And the Yankees are going to the World Series. Aaron Boone has hit a home run. The Yankees go to the World Series for the 39th time in their remarkable history. Aaron Boone down the left field line.
Yankees win.
Yankees win.
If I never have to see another video of Derek Jeter happy in my life, I will be okay. Oh, I didn't go to bed after that game. The Yankees and Red Sox famously play into all hours of night. I sat in my couch staring at the television until the middle of the night, telling myself how sad it was that I put so much of my joy in a game that I had no control over. I began doing the math and realized how many people had lived, rooted for the Red Sox their entire life, and died without them seeing a single World Series victory. At that point, it had been 85 years since they had last won their last World Series. I became convinced that night, in all seriousness, that I would never see my team celebrate a World Series, and that the sort of joy and time and energy that I was putting into this team would never pay me back. And so for all of the hours and time that I invested in enjoying sports, it was a time that was wasted because I always ended up in this depressed state. I found that my belief in my team was unwarranted, and I began to doubt them for the first time. I was at this point 22 years old. I don't know that we're always in the best state of mind at 22 years old, but at that point I decided that I thought I could live another 60 years and I would never see the Red Sox win a World Series. And that was way too much time and energy and money poured into something that would never pay me back. This is the sort of thing that your high-powered rival hitting a home run to go to the World Series against you can create. If you've rooted for sports at all, you probably have that moment in your history where something incredibly bad happened right in front of your face, and the despair is the lowest of lows. And those moments of hurt and pain create doubt. And doubt is a struggling, unfortunate feeling, but it's one that's common and maybe even necessary. Doubt is a feeling of not being certain about something, especially about how good or true it is. Being a doubter, being in a state of doubt, is a posture that doesn't always feel real comfortable when you're there. Doubting something makes you feel often like you're offline. Why is everyone else in on this? Why am I the outlier? Why is my gut turning? Am I too much of a doubter? Why can't I just put my faith in things? Why am I so cynical? These are the sort of things we'll ask when we're in a season of doubt. But doubt isn't necessarily a bad thing either, is it? For example, I've saved myself a lot of time, money, and energy in my life because of doubt. For example, I won't watch the new M. Night Shyamalan movie anytime it comes out because I know it's not going to be good anymore. The man had 2 stories and 2 movies and he's done. And so I don't go to the movie theater hoping that he can relive his Sixth Sense past. I doubt, for example, that DC Comics is going to put out any movies that are anything as good as what Marvel has done. So I don't waste my time and my money. I doubt that when my children tell me that their room is clean the first time, that it really is. And that doubt saves me a lot of grief because I don't walk in angry when I see that it's not quite done. I prepare myself and then help them make a plan and then put my trust in the later checkings. I doubt, for example, that Taco Bell commercial that looks so delicious is going to match what actually comes in my sack when I go through the drive-thru. I'm no longer disappointed by my Taco Bell experiences. I doubt that anything Billy Mays says about Kaboom, Flex Seal, Mighty Tape, or that knife is going to work. If there are doubts in a rocket that's supposed to launch, they're canceled. The launchings are canceled so that things don't explode. If you have doubts about the one that you're dating, you should investigate those doubts before making a permanent commitment. Doubt can be a profoundly helpful tool. It could be helpful in small things like movie tickets, and it could be helpful in big things like making commitments in relationships. Doubt can be big and doubt can be small, but doubt creates an ability for us to not be fooled, not to be duped, not to make mistakes that hurt us in the long run. And doubt, it seems, is coming around to be understood as something that's hardwired into us. We're not necessarily doubters because of some sort of social experience, but our brain actually creates doubt. In fact, the University of Iowa College of Medicine, about 10 years ago, did a study about doubt. And they particularly located doubt in a part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And so these people in the University of Iowa College of Medicine did a study where they took people who had damage to that part of their brain. And they did a study of showing known to be false advertisements that the FCC, the FTC had called misleading. And they showed the people who had had damage in this part of their brain, in their prefrontal cortex, these advertisements. Then they showed another control group of people who had had brain damage in other parts of their brain, but not the prefrontal cortex, these same commercials. And then they showed another third group of people who had had no history of brain damage, the same misleading commercials. And they found in just incredible numbers that the people who had damaged that place that they thought that they had located doubt in the prefrontal cortex bought it hook, line, and sinker, compared to the people who had had damage in other places in their brain and no damage at all. We're hardwired for doubt. And doubt is something that gives us an ability to work through this world and keep us safe. It's a part of our safety net. But we can become too much of a doubter as well. We can lean on our doubt so much that we don't experience the good things of this world as well. It's a healthy thing to be a doubter, but it's a healthier thing to be in conversation with your doubt. To let your doubt speak, but to not let your doubt be the final word. And so today, as the sermon bumper video showed, we're talking about doubt, and we're talking about Thomas, in particular, Thomas's struggle to believe that Jesus was bodily risen from the grave. And I love this story of Thomas with all of my heart. I am so thankful that John showed it to us, because 2,000 years later, we are not only hardwired for doubt, we are trained for doubt. I think we read this story best, not when we accuse Thomas of being wrong, but when we take a moment to put on Thomas's shoes and consider the struggle that he has. And so we're going to read this story from John chapter 20. We're going to read verses 24 through 29. Let's experience this story together. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." We're told pretty explicitly in this text that Jesus' very goal, and one of the massive themes in the whole Gospel of John, is to help us transform our doubt into belief. Belief for John, as he writes this gospel, is key throughout. His goal is to help us become believers, faithful people who put our trust that Jesus is indeed Lord, God, that he was crucified, buried, raised from the dead, and now ascended to the Father to live as the resurrected one. So, if our goal is to believe, what is the prescription to move us from doubt to belief? In the year 2020, doubt is incredibly cheap. You can purchase doubt on any corner for almost no money whatsoever. You don't have to put effort. You don't have to put time. Doubt is cheaper than it has ever been before. Belief is complicated. Log on to Facebook when you're done here. You can find two people who you deeply, deeply respect and love tell you the same exact situation and interpret it in two very different ways. Belief is complicated. Truth is hard to get at. And doubt is so easy to find. So how do we move to belief if we're in a place of doubt? That Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is God, that Jesus was resurrected. Frankly, these stories are complex to believe, especially in our era today. And so baked into the story that we've read today is a bit of a hint of what John sees as the prescription to move from doubt to belief. You see, what we're told here is in the gatherings that on the first day of the week, Sunday, there's a celebration of the resurrection that becomes Christian worship. You may recall that in the Jewish culture, they would worship on the end of the week, the Sabbath, on Saturday. They would worship on the day of rest. Christians adopted Sunday as the day to worship because it's the first day of the week that Jesus rose from the dead. And so we worship on Sundays, and it's on this day that the disciples are gathering together. And while Thomas hadn't had the opportunity to gather with them in verse 19, which we're told is the first day of the week, he had not seen the risen Lord. And because he wasn't there, he goes back and meets with them, we're told in verse 26, again on a Sunday morning. The disciples are clearly making it a pattern of their life to gather to begin their week on Sundays to worship the risen Lord. And what they do when they come together to worship is that they declare, they proclaim that the Lord is alive, that they have seen him, that they have experienced him. And this is a vital part of their worship together, the shared testimony of their experience with Jesus Christ. And Thomas comes to this gathering in spite of his doubt. He doubts and he hears them saying that they have seen the Lord, but he can't bring his gut or his head to believe that it's actually happened. Belief is a struggle for him and doubt reigns. But he keeps showing up week after week. And we're told on the next week he shows up again, and this time Jesus showed up as well. And he showed up in a pre-ascended form. His body has been resurrected. The wounds remain on his body. The hole from the spear in his side, the holes in his hand. He is the wounded lamb, and he has made himself known in their worship gathering. The prescription for doubt is to show up for worship, whether or not you're ready to join the disciples' proclamation. Because when Thomas came, still a doubter, still suspicious, still not sure that this was all true, Jesus showed up because of the believers gathering to proclaim that he was the risen Lord. Jesus gathers among the believers, and the doubters see that the story has come alive in front of them. There's two ways to talk about this story. One is if you doubt, if you struggle with doubt, Jesus doesn't not encounter you, right? Jesus encounters the doubters. He goes straight to Thomas. Keep on coming to worship. But if doubt is not your thing, if doubt is not your struggle, if you have the gift of faith and you are a believer through and through, you have a role to be a proclaimer of what Jesus has done in the midst of worship. Your proclamations, your storytelling, your firm belief could be what keeps drawing the doubters back in to gather. Your firm belief may be what invites the presence of the Spirit to come, the presence of Christ himself when it's least expected, that helps the people who have gathered in doubt. You have a role, whether believer or doubter, in worship to invite the presence of Christ to come in. And in spite of his doubt, Jesus goes straight to Thomas. He doesn't stop to talk to Peter. He doesn't have a conversation with John. He doesn't engage immediately the ones who seem like the insiders. He makes his way to the ones who are struggling. When Jesus shows up in the midst of worship, he doesn't marginalize those who aren't quite ready to believe. He finds us where we're at, whether or not we're fully arrived, or deep down in our gut, we know we're struggling. Jesus goes straight to Thomas, and he invites him to experience him in a physical and bodily way. And when Thomas does experience Jesus, he makes a proclamation that may seem simple, but is vitally important. It's the only time in the four Gospels that anyone confesses specifically that Jesus is God. The words are in Thomas's mouth. The authors edit in this sort of language. The rest of the New Testament makes clear that Jesus is God. But Thomas looks Jesus in the eye and says, "My Lord and my God." The experience of Jesus in such a profound way transforms us, or can transform us immediately from doubt to a profound testimony that we now see it. If we have doubt, our role is not to run towards our doubt, but our role is to take our doubt, to pick it up, to put it on our shoulder, and walk to the sanctuary and set it down next to us. And let our doubt be a part of our worship. Because it does not preclude Jesus from showing up and spending time with you. Jesus is interested in you, whether doubt is a struggle or not. For those of us who don't doubt, our role is to keep telling the story so that we can help the doubters come to the experience of seeing Jesus in a very real and personal way. So the theme of this text, it seems, is certainly doubt, but more so than just that, it's the importance of gathering to worship. Because when we gather to worship and make Jesus central, Jesus has a habit of showing up. And when Jesus shows up, he does incredible work both with the doubters and the faithful alike. We're to build our life around this pattern of worshiping to begin our week, that we start Sunday mornings with attending to worship. Because when we come to worship, we may not always feel it. It may not be Jesus who comes to me, but my worship may be so inviting to Jesus that he shows up and goes to the ones that we're praying for, the ones that we love, the ones that we're yearning to experience the bodily and risen Lord. Our attention to worship may not always be for me, but it could be transformative to those that we gather around side of. So we worship, and we do it regularly, and we come weekly, and it's not always about me. The star of this story is not Peter and John. The star of this story is Peter and John showing up quietly and seeing the transformation of their friend because Christ met them in worship. So how does this text work in a time of separation? Man, this would be a much easier and funner sermon to preach if I were looking at you right underneath me and in an old fire and brimstone way, I could wag my finger and say, you better be back here next week. This is important stuff that we're doing here. But gathering seems so different. And yet, meeting in our homes is not fully different than the way this text works. There were no cathedrals for Christians to gather in Jerusalem. They met quietly at their homes in smaller groups. And they declared Jesus was Lord in places that were small and comfortable. And it was within their own small family, if you will, that doubt emerged. And they proclaimed the presence of Christ in their life. And a person that they had spent the last 3 years traveling the dusty streets of Israel saw their doubt transformed into belief. There's work of worship to be done in these digital spaces. Carving out this time, whether or not this time is freer than it was 5 months ago, still remains vitally important. Your testimony that Jesus is Lord in your homes, in front of your kids, by your spouses, to your extended family, remains vitally important to help become a witness for the sake of the world that Jesus is risen and he has made a tangible difference in your life. But furthermore, there is a season in the scripture that helps us in this time as well. It's not related to Jesus, but it ushered in the story of Jesus. And that was the middle sections of the Old Testament called the exile. In that place, the people of God were taken away from what was comfortable, and they could no longer go to their synagogue or their temple. All of that was laid in rubble by Babylon, and the people were taken off into a faraway place. And in the exile, they asked a question that is repeated in Psalm 137. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Now, that may be not how you word it, but that may be the cry of your heart. How can I sing the Lord's song in this time? It translates fairly easily into, how can I experience the joy of worship or communion sitting in front of a computer? How can I celebrate the Ascension or Pentecost without being with my brothers and sisters? This feeling of Psalm 137 speaks to the distance we're in. And there aren't easy answers to those questions. But we do know that in the exile, when they were taken from their homeland and their home of worship, and they couldn't gather together because there were pagan gods, anytime the rubber met the road, someone was faithful, even distant from their worship experiences. And God acted in bold and mighty ways. Daniel went to the lion's den and declared his faith before the king, and the lion did not eat him. Esther was unafraid of precedents for the queen and spoke boldly to the king and saved God's people from massacre. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to worship the God du jour of the day, was sent into a fire, and saw that God showed up and spared their lives. There are times to be faithful, to proclaim the goodness of God even in separation. And we find that God shows up when we're faithful, even if it's not in the circumstances that's most comfortable or normal for us. And it's testimonies by everyday normal people like you and me, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that become the antidote for the doubt that seems so reasonable that those around us have. If we can lean into worship with our belief, we may help more than we realize in helping doubt become eliminated because of our welcoming of Christ into our moments of worship in our world, whether here, home, work, or otherwise. Doubt has a way of being transformed into belief. It happens with Christ, but it happens in other ways in our lives as well. Started out by telling the story of my favorite baseball team and the deep depression I went into after watching yet another loss. And 1 year later, it seemed like the Red Sox were up to the same old tricks that they were always up to. The Yankees won the division, down 3-0 in the American League World Series, with the most recent loss being 19-8. I was a youth pastor at that time, and I had brought my teens to a pool, and there was a TV up. And again, I was in that same space of standing in the shallow end of the pool with my hands over the edge, watching the Yankees parade around the bases, thinking, why do I do this to myself? 3-0 had never, ever been overcome before. But 1 year later, after I'd cast myself into complete doubt, the Red Sox won 4 straight games and ended up winning their first World Series in 86 years. Doubt is not the end of the story. There is redemption. There can be victory on the other side of doubt. Now, baseball is a silly comparison. It doesn't matter anything compared to our spiritual lives or our connection to Christ. But the doubts that we have aren't always the final word. But when we can set our doubt aside, even for just a moment, sometimes if we can live through the doubt, the redemption that comes when we finally experience victory can be so sweet. It can be so life-giving and transformative. And my hope is that if you've come today with a little bit of doubt, that you don't curse yourself or put yourself down because you struggle with doubt, but recognize that coming to worship, you never know when Jesus will show up and make it personal to you. And when Jesus leads you through the doubt into belief, you will experience a transformation that's beyond description. And all of the doubt will seem so small compared to the reality of the risen Lord. And you will be able to join Thomas by saying, Jesus, my Lord and my God. Let's conclude today by singing together this final song.